2 months ago, I was able to get my hands on the Audi RS3. Quite simply, the best thing I have driven in 2022, actually in quite a long time. And that begs the question, after driving the RS3, is the S3 disappointing, or is this really the best value proposition in the Audi lineup? Does this give you some of the flavor of the RS for a lot less cash, or should you just get the RS3 if you can afford one? The first thing we should do is break down the Audi 3 lineup, because in some ways you could say that the S3 is more A3 turned up to 11 than RS3 dialed back down to 9. The A3 starts things off with 201 horsepower thanks to a 2-liter 4-cylinder turbo under the hood. You'll get that for $34,900. Then we get the S3 for $45,900. That cranks the 2-liter turbo all the way up to 306 horsepower. The RS3 uses a different engine and some different systems as well, but power goes all the way up to 401 horsepower and the price tag goes way up to $58,900, assuming you can get one for MSRP. You are much more likely to get an S3 for MSRP than an RS3. But visually, the S3 and the RS3 are pretty similar. The differences really happen right down here on the bumper. The grille is very similar. The headlights are essentially the same between the S3 and RS3, including the animated startup sequence that we have in this multi-module daytime running lamp section. Obviously, we have different wheels in the S3 and RS3, but the tires are quite different as well, much wider in the RS3. The RS3 has a staggered tire setup, 265 width up front, 245 in the rear. This is symmetrical with 235s in the front and 235s in the back. The really wide front tires are why the RS3 has an exaggerated fender flare and then the vent right behind that, but it does use the same doors as the S3. I think the exhaust setup in the S3 is a bit more aggressive, oddly enough, than the RS3. We get quad exhaust tips rather than the dual exhaust tips we find in the more high-performance oriented model. We have full LED taillight modules, basically shared with the rest of the lineup, with progressive amber turn signals, which is a nice touch. And yep, in case you're wondering, the front turn signals, those are also progressive. Now let's take a deeper dive under the hood. As I said, the A3 and S3 have related engines. They're both 2-liter 4-cylinder turbos, but the 2-liter turbo that we find in the S3 is significantly different than the one that we find in the regular A3. And that's how we get to 306 horsepower. So more boost, more cooling, more focus on performance. We also get 295 pound-feet of torque, which is a pretty significant bump. But not as much torque as we find in the RS3 because it does use a bigger displacement engine. The transmission available in this one is a 7-speed dual clutch. It'll give you 0 to 60 in 4.5 seconds and 26 miles per gallon combined. Audi's Quattro all-wheel drive system is standard in the S3, but it's not the same all-wheel drive system that we find in the RS3. That system has the ability to send more power to the rear, and it has a torque vectoring function across the back. This lacks that function. So it can send power to the rear whenever it wants to, but it cannot send it across the rear axle mechanically. It's going to have to use the brake-based system in order to try and direct power here and there, basically the traction control and stability control system. Now, this 4-cylinder turbo doesn't have quite the same kind of sound that we find in the RS3. Some people may see that as a positive, some people may not, depending on how you feel about a 5-cylinder burble. That will definitely get you quicker 0 to 60 though, 3.6 seconds for the RS3 versus, again, 4.5 for this one. As you might expect, we have sport seats up front, but they're not quite as aggressive as the ones in the RS3, I think. We have a 4-way adjustable lumbar support, extending thigh cushion, manual tilt telescopic steering column with a large range of motion, and the front passenger seat has the same range of motion as the driver's seat, but it is lacking the 2-position memory. One of the things I've always loved about the A3 family is how well packaged it is. This is still a small sedan, don't get me wrong, this front seat's adjusted for me at 6 feet tall. I have about 1.5 inches of legroom left, and headroom is somewhat limited. I'd have to crank my head to one side in order to fit back here. But this is not really that much less roomy than something like a BMW 3 Series. You will find, of course, more room in an Audi A4, but not as much more room as you might think. You will, however, find a wider bench across the rear. So if you want to try and put 5 people in here, it is going to be a little bit tight. But even with this front seat all the way back in its tracks, I can sit back here and my knees are almost touching the seat back, but not quite. This is a pretty comfortable interior for 4 to go away for a weekend. Thanks to the transverse mounted engine, the A3 is really well packaged, and you really could put 4 people's worth of luggage back here in the rear as long as they didn't pack heavy. One odd twist with this generation of the A3 platform is that there's nowhere to put a spare tire under the load floor, because even though there's kind of a spare tire well down there, they have the 12-volt battery right in the middle and this large foam divider around. I guess you could put some small knickknacks in there, but I think it would be a bit handier if we had at least a collapsible spare. Now let's go for a spin around the interior. You can see that we have a pretty standard sized moonroof just over the driver and front passengers' heads. The front seats get an S logo embossed just there below the fixed in-place headrest. That does look adjustable, but it is in fact not. We do, however, have height adjustable shoulder belts. From this angle, you can see the aggressive bolstering on the seat back and seat bottom cushion, and you can also see how relatively small the front door is. If you're a taller driver, you might end up finding yourself driving with your head right next to that pillar. That can be a little bit bad for visibility, but I love the fact that Audi moves those seat tracks so far rearward. Moving over to the front doors, we have a relatively plain style. Harder plastics down at the bottom in order to help improve durability, softer plastics up top, and of course a soft touch armrest. The dashboard design is distinctly Audi, and of course if you're wondering what you're driving, you can double check that there's a Quattro badge right there. Lots of ambient lighting trim around the vehicle. I really love how this strip is really well integrated into the dashboard. We have a slot style glove compartment in there. I was not able to fit a 10-inch tablet computer inside. In the middle of the dashboard, we have the touchscreen infotainment system. This is running Audi's MMI software. I don't find this quite as intuitive as I once did. I think it's because most of the competition has had more advanced software, more software refreshes, etc. since then. This does feel just a little bit old school and sometimes can feel a little bit sluggish. The counterpoint to the infotainment system is this large LCD instrument cluster, which I think is one of the best in the industry. I love how it's not square. They do give some chamfered corners there to give it some extra drama. We also get the Google satellite imagery. Now, big thing to know about that, a subscription is required in order to keep that active. But the look is excellent. The display is also highly configurable. Lots of different readouts, lots of different views that you can choose from. You have a media view, you can choose a tachometer-centric view, etc. You can also get lots of different trip computer readouts, lots of information going on there. Moving back to the center console, under the infotainment screen, we have the controls for the dual zone automatic climate control. There's the drive mode button there, stability control, auto start stop on off, 2 USB-C ports, a large area there where you can store your smartphone, engine start stop button, the same shifter that we find in the RS3. It's a toggle shifter, so pull down there for drive, reverse, park is that button right there. Then we get the controls for the infotainment system on that side. Down here we have the electric parking brake, 12-volt power port, 2 fixed cup holders there, and then kind of a small storage area under that center armrest. The armrest does ratchet into position, so if you want it to be a little bit higher, you can actually keep it in those higher positions. It doesn't just have to go flush with the storage area. The steering wheel is a 4-spoke design. We have sort of a split bottom spoke down there, paddle shifters on the back. Controls for the cruise control are still on a stalk down there like we find in other Audi models. The controls for the multifunction LCD cluster are over here on the left side. You roll around the options with that one, toggle through the different views, and then toggle between the 2 layouts for each of those views with that view button there. We then have a favorites button and then infotainment buttons on this side. It's now time to get the S3 out on the road, so clearly we have to floor it first. You're definitely going to notice that it has a 4-cylinder sound, and it's definitely going to be slower than the RS3. 0 to 60 happened in this model in 4.5 seconds versus 3.3 in the RS3. That was an incredible performance from that vehicle. You don't have the same sense of urgency, the same sort of being whipped back in your seat in here that you find in the RS3, but it is still an absolute ton of fun. And even though the tires are appreciably narrower, stopping distance is still excellent. 109 feet for this model versus 101 feet for the RS3. Definitely an excellent stopping distance. And handling is excellent as well, thanks to the light curb weight that we find in all of the A3 platform vehicles. A lot of folks just assume that because this is based on a transverse engine layout, that handling is not going to be as good as some of the rear-wheel drive competition. I would say you're thinking about it wrong. It depends on what you mean by handling. If we're talking about gripping the road holding, this is positively excellent compared to the average compact luxury sedan. As far as driving dynamics power on, those options are going to be a little bit more fun if you like rear-wheel drive driving dynamics, but the all-wheel drive system here helps sort some of that out. Now, it is still heavier up front, and because we don't have the wider tires up front like we find in the RS3, this is less able to compensate for that. So you are going to notice in neutral handling situations that the front end is going to push a little bit towards the outside of the curve, a bit more than you'd find in the RS3 or something like a BMW 3 Series. On the other side of things, though, I think this has a little bit less understeer than we find in certain versions of the Audi A4, because that's bigger, it's heavier, and it actually has a bit more weight completely in front of the front axle than we find in the S3. Out on a rougher road like the one that I'm on here, I think Audi has done an excellent job tuning this suspension. Now, the S3 does have an adaptive suspension system, so I can toggle this drive mode selector and put it in a more comfortable mode. I was in the firmest mode there. And in comfort mode, it does a pretty decent job soaking up the large and small bumps, and it doesn't have the sort of bouncy feeling that you can sometimes get in the new Honda Civic Type R. The reason I'm going to give ride quality a B+ is that this suspension is not appreciably more forgiving than the one that we find in the RS3. They're actually quite similar. However, I think that both of these are really a good balance between sporty handling needs and daily driver livability. I would have absolutely no problem driving this daily on rough roads, potholed roads, even gravel roads like I'm on here. This is definitely comfortable enough for that. I wouldn't want to do this for hours at a time, but this is certainly something that you could do on your daily commute, absolutely no problem. The one area where some folks might be disappointed in the S3 is the engine exhaust note. There's still going to be pops and burbles from the 4-cylinder engine, depending on exactly what you're doing and what mode you're in, but it's never going to sound as exciting and as raucous as the RS3 that has a very memorable sound from that 5-cylinder engine. But it's also not quite as exciting as some of the other 4-cylinder turbocharged performance vehicles out there. You might be surprised to hear that I think that the Volkswagen Golf R actually sounds a little bit better with a very similar drivetrain under its hood versus the Audi S3. In terms of cabin noise, I measured 70 decibels in here at 50 miles an hour, making this exactly the same as the RS3. That surprised me because the tires are definitely wider on that RS3, but I think most of what we're getting is noise coming from other areas of the vehicle. This is relatively quiet for the compact and subcompact luxury category, but you will find some quieter options out there. Not that fuel economy is the biggest consideration for a lot of shoppers, but you'll be hard-pressed to find better fuel economy with similar levels of fun and performance. I've been averaging 27 miles per gallon, a little bit above the EPA average, even though I've been driving this pretty hard. That's really impressive, especially considering that there are a number of front-wheel drive competitors that you might want to cross up against this that will actually get you worse fuel economy. For instance, the new Civic Type R that I was just driving yesterday, which is why I keep mentioning it so often, will get you 24 miles per gallon according to the EPA, 2 miles per gallon less, and it's front-wheel drive, not all-wheel drive. Now's a good time to talk about why you might want all-wheel drive on your next performance vehicle. All-wheel drive is not going to improve neutral handling situations, so as we're going down this road, it's not going to help the handling around the corners because that's all about weight balance and grip and suspension design, etc. Where all-wheel drive is going to help you out is pretty much everywhere else. On this road surface, which is actually a little bit damp, I can floor it, not worry at all. Also, if the road surface is bumpy, again like this road surface, you can floor it, not worry at all. In a two-wheel drive vehicle, whether it's a front-wheel drive vehicle or a rear-wheel drive vehicle, traction is going to be a problem because of the bumps in the road. This Quattro system can apply that power because all four wheels are doing the work. Also, if you're trying to carve your favorite winding mountain road, you can apply power a little bit earlier without worry. You're going to get a tiny bit of rear-end rotation, but also you're going to get excellent grip, helping you around the corner. And in a rear-wheel drive vehicle, you could apply power at around the same time. You have to be judicious, but you could do it. In a front-wheel drive car, you have to wait until you're a lot further down the corner before you can start applying that power, because you just can't get the wheels to do all the steering and all the power at the same time. This doesn't have that same problem. Even though it cannot send as much power to the rear or torque vector across the rear like you'll find in some alternatives, the RS3 most notably, it can definitely have that rear end feeling very, very lively in the back, very much like a rear-wheel drive car. We don't get that in this. Instead, we just get absolutely incredible levels of grip, regardless of the surface. This is an absolute hoot and a half to drive. But the big thing about this is that it's comfortable fun. It feels very, very confidence-inspiring. And the two-wheel drive competition, they're just not confidence-inspiring in the same way. They're very capable, they just don't feel quite like this. Obviously the S3 is fun, but again for me I think it's the accessibility of the fun that's the big deal here. Without a doubt, the RS3 is an A3 with the knob turned all the way up to 11. Where does that leave the S3? Well, this turns the knob down to maybe an 8. It is not the same level of bonkers fun as an RS3. It doesn't have the torque vectoring axle. It doesn't handle like one, etc. But I think that's okay. And I think I might actually buy an S3 over the RS3 for two important reasons. But I certainly would not buy one of these over an M3, and I would buy the RS3 before I M3'd or C63'd. That, of course, you'll have to check out in the RS3 video. The reason I would probably get the S3 over the RS3 if my own money were on the line, simply has to do with finances. This is going to be a lot less expensive to buy, a lot less expensive to keep around, maintain, etc. More parts commonalities with other Audi models. That 5-cylinder engine is really very, very rarely used in the Audi lineup, so things are just going to be more expensive to keep around there. Now, on the other hand, you are going to have to live with slower 0 to 60 times, longer stopping distances, although they are still relatively quick, and an exhaust note that is just not as exciting or raucous as the one in the RS3. Again, also not quite as healthy of a competitor to those bigger boys as the RS3 really is. And that's what I love about that model. It's so much fun. It is so chuckable. But you can get the S3 close to that. You could upgrade the tires, and you could spend a decent amount of money on performance upgrades for your S3 and not approach the price tag of the RS3. There's also attainability. The RS3 is really hard to find. You're probably going to be paying bigger markups for it than you would for the S3. The S3 is also interesting when you compare this against some of the newer crop of mainstream performance options out there, most notably something like the top-end version of the Corolla, the GR Corolla, or the Honda Civic Type R. It may sound weird to compare an Audi against a Honda and a Toyota, but the pricing is not too far off. The new Type R is going to be about $45,000 realistically, but $10,000, $15,000 markups are seemingly the norm there. You could easily get an RS3 for that price, and you'd have all-wheel drive. You'd give up a tiny bit of horsepower, but you'd have a dual-clutch transmission that real world will get you faster 0 to 60 than anyone will ever be able to go in that Honda Civic Type R. It's going to be about 5 seconds with a professional driver. This, 4.5 seconds with absolutely anybody behind the wheel. And of course, the all-wheel drive system. The handling, I think, is a tiny bit sharper sometimes in the Type R, but I like the driving dynamics of the S3. You're probably not going to notice the difference too much unless you're out on a track or an autocross course where the Type R is going to be superior. But for every other driving situation, I would simply take the S3. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comments section. And do you agree that the S3 is sort of the rational middle ground in the Audi lineup? The A3 is kind of slow, 201 horsepower. The RS3, bonkers fast, bonkers expensive. S3, I think it's kind of the Goldilocks just right option. But then let me know whether you think that this should be the best car I drove in 2022. I can't say that. I still think the RS3 is, but this is really darn close, and it's probably the one that I would buy.